Picture this. You are the long-standing head bodyguard to the president, and you've seen it all. From protesters to assassination attempts, to aerial attacks from flying lawnmowers, you've been through it. If anyone has a beef with the orange man, they'll have to get through you first, and today will be no different. Suddenly, you get a frantic call from the director at Area 51. "One of the monsters has escaped!" he yells. You leap up to go, but not so fast, you eager Ernie. This isn't just any regular old world-destroying super monster. This thing is a 4D beast. Those things are immune to good old pile drivers, and you definitely won't take it out with a headbutt, so you may want to hold up on the violence for a bit and listen to the briefing for the first time in your life. First off, you're going to need to know what a four-dimensional being is, and to understand that, you may want to get a grasp of dimensions in the first place. We live in a three-dimensional world where you can create three mutually perpendicular axes. Axi? Axes. Plural of axis. Three mutually perpendicular axes, or a four-dimensional world with three space dimensions and one time dimension, if you're into that Minkowski kind of stuff. If that flew in through one orifice on the side of your head and came straight out the other side, you can think about it by slowly adding dimensions one by one. A one-dimensional world would be a line with zero width and zero height. You could move back and forth along it, and your entire vision would be limited to a dot, but getting past anyone would be about as hard as trying to maneuver an elephant through a hole that didn't exist. If you added another direction of movement perpendicular to your first dimension, you would get a whole new plane of movement, and you would end up with a world with two dimensions. This is where things start to become a little bit more familiar. Still quite off, but a little bit closer. Everything you saw would be limited to a single line of vision with no height, which while still extremely disorienting, would become maneuverable over time. Unlike in the one-dimensional world, you can now move around things. You wouldn't be able to walk through walls, but instead you could walk around them, or find a door, or just blow it up. You could move around by pushing yourself off of things, visit other people, and maybe even make some shape art. But even here, in the open expanse of a flat 2D land, you would find yourself limited in many ways. You wouldn't be able to climb ladders because ladders wouldn't even exist. How can you climb something to bring you higher if higher doesn't exist? In fact, if you had lived as a 2D creature all your life, chances are you wouldn't have even been able to conceive of a third dimension, in quite the same way a one-dimensional creature wouldn't be able to conceive of a two-dimensional world. Now let's add one more dimension and we get the familiar world that is our universe. By adding another direction of travel that is perpendicular to the two that we already have, we can now have a world where climbing is possible. Our vision is essentially a 2D image, but now we can even climb over or under those pesky walls. So, knowing all this, you may now think you're an expert, and say that to get a fourth dimension, all we have to do is add another perpendicular direction of movement, and you would be right. It is probably pretty hard for you to picture this, impossible even, but that's okay. Just because you can't picture the world of our 4D beast, doesn't mean we can't know things about it. Let's start by imagining 3D objects passing through 2D worlds, and 2D objects passing through 1D worlds. When we play hide and seek, we don't just hide out in the open, we can hide behind walls. Same thing with a 2D object. If a 2D object wanted to hide from another 2D object, it could hide behind a 2D wall. Here's the problem though. Even though you can hide from other objects in the same dimension as you can't hide from an object that lives in a higher dimension. If the stickman you drew on your homework decided it didn't want you to see it, where could it go? Lock itself in a room? You could just peer right over top of the walls. And what if a line man tried to go incognito? Would it hide between two other line people? Any 2D shape could simply walk around them. This observation isn't limited to just these dimensions, oh no. Just like 2D objects can't be stopped from looking at 1D objects, and 3D people can see everything that goes on with 2D people, so can 4D creatures peep in on the lives of us. Walls are only a thing to the world they exist in and the worlds below them. Add one more dimension, and hide and seek loses every ounce of whatever little fun it offered. No one cares if you decide to drop that deuce in the gold safes of Fort Knox. If a 4D personal space invader wants to watch you, they will most certainly catch you with your pants down. This leads to a bigger point, however, which is the 4D creature's most powerful weapon. Just like a room can't hide its contents from a higher dimensional being, so your skin can't hide your organs. When we look down at a circle drawn on paper, we don't just see the shape, but everything inside of it as well. Without having to even be in its world but for a brief moment, we could poke a hole through the pancake guts of our 2D friends. If a 4D person wanted to, they could simply poke you in the insides, from literally inside of you, and then leave without a trace. So okay then, how do we know if a 4D monster is coming after us, you ask? Well, the truth is, it's hard to say, and sometimes even impossible. With an extra dimension to hide in that we can't even interact with, our pursuers could be right next to us without us knowing. Now of course, to strike, every creature must enter the lower dimension at least for a moment. You can't poke a hole through a piece of paper without sliding your scissors through it, and this is our opportunity to strike back. Now before you grab your shotgun and go racing off to hunt some 4D bounty, there's one more thing to understand, that being what they are going to look like. How do you know what a 4D creature will look like when you get that opportunity? Once again, we can think about this by comparing what it would look like for us to travel through a 2D world, which is something you probably already know about. Pictures are only 2D, so when we want to know what is going on inside someone's skull, we take a CT scan of their head, which is represented in tons and tons of 2D cross-sections. This lets us take something that's 3D and which we usually can't see inside of, and turn it into 2D pictures which are easy to manage. Something interesting you might notice is that the scan looks much larger when looking at the middle part of the head and gets smaller as it slides to the top of the skull. This is because your head tapers, and we can see the exact same thing when we think of a sphere passing through a 2D plane. To a 2D observer, a sphere passing through its plane would look like the cross-sections of a CT scan. It would appear out of nowhere, grow in size until it passed halfway through, start to shrink, and eventually pass out of existence the moment the 2D plane no longer made a slice through the sphere. For a 4D sphere passing through our 3D world, it would do pretty much the same thing. It would appear out of nowhere as a small ball, growing in size as we saw the 3D cross-sections of the shape, and would start to shrink and once again go out of existence. Finally, we've come to the point in the presentation that you've been waiting for. How do we escape it, and how do we attack it? If we start with the first question, we realize quickly that hiding is not an option. Any room you hide in, any lock you put on a door will be no match for the 4D killer, because they can simply slip past in their extra dimension. You can't hide, but you most definitely can run. If we found ourselves in hot pursuit of a flat person, they could simply continue running, making us chase after them. Just because we have an extra direction to jump in doesn't give us an edge on catching things that simply scurry away along the ground. If you keep on running, the 4D creature will be forced to follow, and if you have more stamina than they do, you may just be able to create some distance between you and them. So running is always a good option, but there might be an even more efficient way of putting distance between us and the monster. If a flat person wanted to get from one end of a piece of paper to the other, they could run from one end to the other, or perform the slightly more intriguing method of bending their 2D world up into 3D space and jumping from one point on their world to another. Chances are you've probably already heard about this kind of thing from science fiction movies. Characters in these movies will use a wormhole, an object with so much gravitational pull that it bends space and time and allows the people to travel through it to move massive distances through space that would normally be impossible. Are they real, you ask? Aren't they just that? Fiction? Well, we already have an interdimensional assassin who can't be kept in a 3D box, but was somehow kept at Area 51 up until now. So how much stupider can this video get? Screw it, let's make wormholes! And now that we have a defensive play, we need to work out an offensive one as well. You can't keep escaping forever. Eventually our attacker will probably figure out how to make a 5D wormhole, and conflict will be inevitable. The first thing you might think to ask about is the anatomy of one of these creatures, and this is where I can't really help you. DNA is the molecule responsible for carrying the genetic instructions for growth, development, and functioning of all known living organisms. Thank you, Wikipedia. Strings of DNA wrap themselves around histones, creating nucleosomes, chromatin loops, condensed chromatin loops, and then eventually chromosomes, which pass the genetic info from parent to child. The point is that with an extra dimension, knots can't exist. With a 4-dimension to slip into, all knots that we know of simply can't be tied, and so the idea of DNA wrapping itself around a nuclear bomb, or whatever it was, is kinda silly. So what do we know about the biology of a 4D creature? Well, not much really. What we can do, however, is once again look at the effects of objects in one world on objects in another world, this time what lower D objects do to higher D objects. When we sharpen a knife, the closer we can bring it to a 2D shape, the sharper it is. Of course, we could never make a 3D knife actually 2D, but if we could, we would notice that it would give zero resistance on contact with a 3D object, and this is where our greatest strength lies. In the same way that a 2D creature would be the ultimately sharp weapon against us, so we are the ultimately sharp weapon against 4D creatures. Unlike a 3D object that would stop your path if walked into, if you ran at a 4D creature, you would slice right through it with no pushback. Yep, at the end of the day, despite being unable to hide from, trap, or detect, the 4D creature's Achilles heel lies in our very 3D nature. So grab a standard machine gun, some pebbles you could throw at it, maybe even a party popper with some now deadly confetti, and just pepper the monster with as many little pieces of material as possible. It doesn't matter what, literally everything would work like a bullet against these things. So suit up, get ready to do your country proud, and go save the president! Ooh, oh, that's a little unfortunate.